Welcome everyone. I think we're going to try to make a start. Welcome to the launch of the Foundations of Global Health and Human Rights, an important one-of-a-kind foundational text on global health and human rights, a topic on all of our minds now amid the difficult global health situation we're now experiencing. How appropriate is it for today's launch to take place on the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, a day to reflect on and celebrate the achievements that have been made through the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. As all on this call will know, the UNCRDP is the latest of the UN treaties striving to enhance the particular protections of classes of persons. It is in itself an illustration of the positive evolution of our global understanding of international human rights protection. The UNCRDP innovates in so many different ways. Most unique from my perspective as a practitioner is its status as the only human rights treaty to recognize intersectional discrimination and the need to adopt a holistic response rather than treat different characteristics in silos. Foundation of Global Health and Human Rights brings together leading health and human rights scholars and practitioners from across the disciplines and across the globe. It is so important in its encapsulating of our past and our present understanding and implementation of human rights in health policy across the globe, was looking forward into the future against the backdrop of the UNCRDP. We have a tremendously esteemed panel with us today, who probably will need no introduction, but I will do so in turn when it comes to their turn to speak. In terms of order of things, we will start with comments from the co-editors and then have mini lectures by two of the co-authors of the chapter on disability and mental health, and then respondents in a panel. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Larry Gostin and Dr. Ben Meier. Professor Gostin is a university professor of Georgetown University and a leading figure across all areas of global health and human rights law, and a key thinker on global health policy at the WHO and UN level. His co-editor, Dr. Ben Meier, is based at the University of Northern Carolina. Oh God, sorry, you've just lost my screen. Sorry, my notes. And has written prolifically on advancing rights-based frameworks for public health and served as a consultant to international organizations, national governments, and NGOs on its implementation. So over to both of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ben said that I could start, and so I will. Thank you, Shushen. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you, particularly on International Day of People with Disabilities. That, as you'll see, that means quite a lot to me, and most of my work in the UK at Mind and at Liberty was devoted to that. And also thank you to Oliver and Soumitra. It's been really wonderful working with you. Ben made the mistake of saying, Larry, you can go ahead and tell some stories. Well, at my age, I've got so many stories that I would literally consume the entire time. So, maybe why don't I'll just tell a couple of them and then explain why this book is so important. I mean, my work in health and human rights began with the great Jonathan Mann. Only the old will remember Jonathan, which is a shame because he was the father of the health and human rights movement, the head of the first head of the WHO's global program on AIDS. And John and I taught the very first class in the world on health and human rights when we were both at Harvard. Since that time, I've worked particularly on AIDS. At the beginning of my career, I was actually in the war room at CDC when the first AIDS cases were reported out of New York and San Francisco. And AIDS is a particularly important time in our lives because it's a pandemic now, even with COVID, but a forgotten pandemic, but yet one that's taken many, many more lives over the years. But also, if we think about International Day of People with Disabilities, really the very start of that was the Americans with Disabilities Act. I know it's hard to think with President Trump in office that the Americans could lead on anything of value, but we did then, and the AIDS movement and people with disabilities, mental health, and others were really instrumental in the ADA, which is really the foundation for so much international work since then. Um, uh, and now, of course, we're at an unrivaled moment in human history, certainly in the last 100 years since the great influenza pandemic of 1918. And human rights, in many cases, has simply been swept aside. When I wrote the Model Emergency Health Powers Act for the US CDC after 9/11, I anticipated most of the kind of measures that we've seen with COVID, like testing, screening, contact tracing, quarantines, isolation. But in my wildest imagination, I could never imagine that the cities the size of Beijing or Delhi or Paris, London or New York would be completely locked down. And so the human rights discourse is only beginning now to form about how we need to think about controlling this pandemic, but also in all health emergencies going forward. I will say this, human rights, means so much to the world. It's probably the modern era's most important idea. And there was a great moment after World War II when the United Nations was formed, the World Health Organization Constitution with its human right to health, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of which Eleanor Roosevelt was so instrumental. And that was a shining moment in our history and one that's guided us. But in this era of nationalism and populism, we've lost so much of those guiding principles and the principle of globalism, of international cooperation and mutual solidarity, which is really at the heart of human rights. What Ben and I realized that despite the power of human rights, there was really no foundational textbook that really explained it in all of its facets and dimensions across sectors. And so Ben and I set out to find the best thinkers, the most wonderful voices and advocates and scholars around the world to deal with all of the important topics of human rights, and hence our book from Oxford University Press, Foundations of Global Health and Human Rights. We're enormously grateful to you for allowing us to help launch it on International Day of People with Disabilities. This book really is intended for the next generation. That's the generation that I'm passing the baton to. We're going to be the ones that are going to be fighting the big battles of human rights, climate change, pandemic preparedness, and so antimicrobial resistance, and so much more. And there's no greater leader that I can think of for the next generation and who will lead the fight than my dear friend and colleague and partner in this and so many endeavors, Ben Mason Meier. Ben is, a voice and a passion and an intellect that's unique in the United States and the world. So thank you, Ben, for all you've done for the field and for me. And I'm going to turn it over to you to give a little bit more in-depth look at what our book tries to accomplish. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Larry, for leading this fight in this field of health and human rights over these many decades, and for conceptualizing this foundational text to support human rights education for global health advancement into the next generation. This field of health and human rights seeks to apply human rights under international law to advance the public's health. And this new book, Foundations of Global Health and Human Rights, looks across the field to support the next generation in scholarship and in advocacy, recognizing that human rights offers universal legal frameworks to advance justice, helping us to elaborate the freedoms and the entitlements that are necessary to realize dignity for all persons. This new field has arisen to address public health as a matter of human rights, examining how international law can frame government responsibilities and thereby shift the health debate from political aspiration to legal accountability. Those of us in this interdisciplinary field bear witness to the ways in which international human rights standards influence people's lives, elevating health concerns in domestic and global governance, facilitating accountability for realizing the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health and social well-being. As a basis for global justice under international law, this textbook seeks to provide students in the field with an understanding of the development of human rights norms and principles to frame the future of global health, introducing a human right to health and the wide range of health-related human rights that support us in realizing public health. But beyond the development of human rights under international law, this book also frames the implementation of those rights in policy and in practice, seeking to understand how international human rights law is translated from the work that's being done in New York and Geneva into meaningful change into individual lives, thinking about the role of advocacy, monitoring, litigation, and global governance in making human rights real. With this foundational understanding of the development and the implementation of human rights to advance public health, we look, as Larry said, across 10 chapters to examine the wide range of human rights that are necessary for disease prevention and health promotion, in the COVID-19 response, in recognizing the importance of water, sanitation, and hygiene, in addressing sexual and reproductive health and rights, thinking about the cataclysmic impacts on health of climate change, and addressing the chronic harms of disability and mental illness. And in understanding the application of human rights law to global health, the chapter that we're highlighting today, that we're celebrating today, seeks to apply human rights to address disability and mental health. And I'm honored that we can celebrate the contributing authors who made this central chapter possible, and to discuss their work on the International Day of People with Disabilities. As Larry and I began to plan for this book, it became clear that this growing literature to foster a new generation would require a sweeping set of contributing authors, with 37 scholars and advocates lending their expertise to elucidate the development, the implementation, and the application of human rights in global health. It's been inspiring to work over the last 2 years with Oliver and Soumitra to develop this chapter on disability and mental health, examining what it means to realize the highest attainable standard of physical health, mental health, and social well-being. Having just taught this chapter in my own health and human rights course, the students found this chapter to be crucial to their understanding of what it means to discuss equal dignity for all persons, raising the need for human rights protections for persons with physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and psychosocial disabilities. Grateful to Shushin for her leadership in this launch. Let me now turn it over to Oliver and Soumitra to share their foundational chapter with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Just before we turn to the two authors, just welcome to all the late joiners. If there are any questions that you may have for the panelists, please feel free to put them in the chat box and I'll try to sweep them up at the Q&A. But without further ado, could I introduce the two authors of the chapter Disability and Mental Health. Dr. Oliver Lewis is a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers, practicing across all areas touching on the right to health. He holds a part-time position as a professor of law and social justice at the School of Law at the University of Leeds. Prior to life at the bar, he spent 15 years working in international human rights law and was involved in the drafting of the UNC-PD. Dr. Soumitra Pathare, a consultant psychiatrist in India, is the director of the Center of Mental Health Law and Policy at ILS Law College in Pune. He takes a rights-based approach to his work and is a leading light in developing global mental health policy. Over to the two of you.
Thanks so much, Shushin. Soumitra and I are going to do a double act on our chapter, with me setting out the evolution of international human rights law, culminating in the CRPD, and Soumitra discussing implementation. But before that, I just want to say a few words of my own thanks. And I want to start off by paying huge tribute to you, Larry, and to acknowledge and thank you for your decades of work across an incredible range of law and global health topics, in which you've played a leading part. Mental health and human rights just being one of those areas. And in the mid-1970s, you were in London, busy at Mind, transforming that organization in a way that has endured in terms of Mind's focus as part of its programming on legal advocacy, and then of course in liberty. So while you were doing that, I was in the meantime busy being born.
Oh boy, it's that bad, is it?
It's not bad, it's just fast forward a few decades, and your idea of the framework convention on global health seems now, in the pandemic, which has exposed health inequalities so painfully, seems more relevant than ever. And it's strange that we've never met face to face, but I just wanted you to know that you've always been a person who I've admired so much and have strived to be more like. So thank you for everything that you have done, Larry, and of course continue to do. And Ben, I think everyone who listened to your few words will agree with me that the field of health and human rights is not only safe in your hands, but through your teaching, scholarship and leadership is drawing more and more fired up people into the field. And I'm really honored, and by the way, that's spelt with a U, to call you a friend, and thank you and Larry for inviting Soumitra and me to contribute our chapter to your incredibly important work. And congratulations to both of you on your achievement. And thank you also for your patience with Soumitra, but mostly with me. We were both recidivist offenders in missing all possible deadlines for the draft chapters. And now to Soumitra, who over a decade ago invited me to work with him on the development of a new international diploma on mental health and human rights. I've been privileged to have worked with him intensively and to have gone to India for most years, for a week or so since then, to train up some new activists for change. And Soumitra is one of the leading lights globally, and of course in India, of psychiatrists calling for radical, well, when I say radical, I mean human rights based, is that radical? Law reform, including a reduction of harm and an increase of respect for autonomy and independence. And he hasn't just advocated for those things, as you'll hear, he's put those principles into action. And one of the examples of that is that he co-drafted the Indian mental health law. And he'll tell us how that came about and the problematics around aligning the law with the principles set out in the CRPD. And Soumitra is a wonderful person, and he's highly irritating, especially to many of his fellow psychiatrists. And my favorite story about Soumitra, I hope he doesn't mind me sharing this, is when he was talking with the president of the Indian Psychiatric Society, who became so irate with Soumitra's radical human rights ideas that there and then he threatened to expel Soumitra from the Indian Psychiatric Society. And Soumitra replied to him, "Sir, I've never wanted to join your organization and have never done so, so please feel free to expel me from it." Lastly, our respondents. Jill Mill, I really look forward to hearing your insights and hearing one of your poems. I'm very excited, and thank you for participating in the webinar. Dr. T, who we'll hear from and who's here right now, and Gerard Quinn, huge congratulations on your recent elections, Dr. T as Special Rapporteur on the right to health. I know Gerard, who will be joining us in about 15 minutes. I know Gerard very well. Over the past 15 years, we've worked closely together, and we're now both affiliated via the Centre for Law and Social Justice at the University of Leeds. And Gerard, for those who don't know, has been elected as the Special Rapporteur on the rights of persons with disabilities. And this being the day, he's being pulled in all sorts of digital directions. So he's only got a limited amount of time, and Shushin will interject him when he arrives. And Dr. T, we've only met on Twitter. I really look forward to meeting you face to face when that allows. But our exchanges on Twitter have been really interesting and have included discussions about frog noises, so on which you may want to expand in your remarks. I wish you and Gerard the very best in the fulfillment of your mandates, and I offer you my support. So let me turn to say a few words about our chapter. So in the chapter, Soumitra and I make the point that, of course, the CRPD is the culmination of centuries of inequality, segregation, torture, and indeed murder of people with psychosocial disabilities and intellectual disabilities. And for those in the UK, the term people with psychosocial disabilities is the globally accepted term for people, this is the phrase in the UK, would be people with mental health issues. The CRPD was developed in the context of decades of slow and unsteady progress in the recognition of the rights of people with disabilities. And in the chapter, we make the point that while the CRPD contains innovations not previously seen in international human rights before, such as national monitoring mechanisms, such as an intersectional approach, such as a duty on the state to ensure participation of people with disabilities in the development of laws and policies that affect them, to name but 3 examples, the CRPD is actually, we say, a result of evolution and not revolution. And we think that that framing is particularly important in terms of how the CRPD lands. So that is to say that the likely net effect of the CRPD is probably going to be more appetizing to policymakers if it's presented in a way that this is the culmination of, it's the latest in the line of a series of thinking, or a series of hard and soft law at the international level and developments in countries all around the world. And in that way, I think we believe that that there will be change. Of course, as Soumitra will explain, not without significant challenge. The chapter plots out the international and picks out some domestic legal developments that sought to challenge segregation, isolation, and inequality. And so we explain how the UN first sought to focus on the rights of people with disabilities, in particular, the rights of people with intellectual disabilities in a 1971 declaration. This declaration contains a word that is absolutely sort of prohibited in disability circles, but I'm going to say the name of the declaration with that government health warning. And so the declaration is called the Declaration on the Rights of Mentally Retarded Persons. And that declaration recommended to states that people with intellectual disabilities participate in community life, but it took for granted that institutionalization, quote, becomes necessary, end quote, for some. So permitting institutionalization, it focused on the basic standards of institutions, essentially making institutions better and institutionalizing institutionalization. The year that I was born, while Larry was busy in London, in 1975, the Declaration of the Rights of Disabled Persons said something similar, that institutional placement of people with disabilities may be indispensable, is the word that it used. Although in a positive development, it suggested that people with disabilities could participate in law and policy reform. And then fast forward to 1991, and we have a mouthful of a paper called The Principles for the Protection of Persons with Mental Illness and the Improvement of Mental Health Care, lovingly called by some the MI Principles. And those principles set out 25 guiding principles for governments to frame mental health legislation. But the primary function of the MI Principles remained the conditions of involuntary detention and forced psychiatric treatment, which many people with psychosocial disabilities at that time saw and continue to see as rights violations in themselves. But then there was a breakthrough. In 1993, the UN adopted the standard rules on the equalization of opportunities for persons with disabilities. And that document acknowledged that, quote, ignorance, neglect, superstition, and fear are social factors that throughout the history of disability have isolated persons with disabilities and delayed their development, end quote. So the standard rules served as an impetus for other parts of the UN to step up, to get with the program and make progress on disability rights under international law. And so where the 1989, of course, 2 years previous to that, UN Convention on the Rights of the Child had become the first international human rights treaty to include a provision about protecting the rights of persons, in that case children, with disabilities, the UN Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, in its general comment in 1994, would draw from the UN standard rules to encourage states to prohibit disability-based discrimination in the public and private sectors. And then we fast forward to the early noughties, where Gerard Quinn, soon to appear any moment now, and law professor from Germany, Theresa Degener, who is a former chair of the UN CRPD committee until quite recently, they clubbed together to write a report that then encouraged the UN system to establish an ad hoc drafting committee that worked for 4 years and resulted in the adoption of the CRPD in 2006. And that's where my story begins to intersect, because in the meantime, I'd studied law at LSE. Big shout out to Jill PA, who's on the webinar, a big influence in my life. Was called to the bar, then started working in Budapest at an international human rights organization called the Mental Disability Advocacy Center. And we were involved in the negotiations alongside many hundreds of other NGOs and in a couple of reports that I'll now outline. And the CRPD, I just want to focus down on one particular problematic of the CRPD, which Soumitra will then go on to illustrate in his words about implementation. So the text says that the provision of healthcare must be on the basis of free and informed consent. And this, coupled with the provision on legal capacity in all areas of life, has given rise to an intensive debate at the academic and policy levels about the future of mental health laws, in particular detention and forced psychiatric interventions. And so if a medical intervention lacks a therapeutic purpose or aims to correct or alleviate a disability without the person's consent, the intervention per the CRPD may constitute torture or another form of ill treatment.
Can I interject with a breaking news? We've got Professor Gerard Quinn online now. He really doesn't need very much introduction, but he is the UN Special Rapporteur on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the godfather of the UNCRPD. His influential report to the UN is what spurred the UN General Assembly to establish an ad hoc committee to negotiate the text that is now the convention. He's therefore at the forefront of thinking about how it can be implemented, and we're extremely privileged that he has been able to join us. Over to you, Professor Quinn.
Oh, no, I was enjoying Oliver. Oliver, you continue. And hi, Soumitra. Please continue.
Gerard, how much time do you have?
No, I have about 25, 30 minutes. So please continue.
I've got probably a couple of more minutes. And then there's Soumitra, who will take, oh, he says 5, but.
No worries, no worries.
All right, shall I continue then? Okay, fine. So we got up to, I was just beginning to describe the sort of problematics in terms of the debate on forced psychiatric detention and treatment. And so we then have a report by Manfred Novak, who was the then UN Special Rapporteur on torture in 2008. And he recognized that people with disabilities, in his words, often experience serious abuse and violations of their rights to physical and mental integrity in institutionalized settings and medical facilities. And he found that, his words again, there can be no therapeutic justification for the use of solitary confinement and prolonged restraint of persons with disabilities in psychiatric institutions. And then his successor, Juan Mendez, continued that line in his 2013 report on torture and ill treatment in healthcare, saying that where such abuses take place, choices by people with disabilities are often overridden based on their supposed best interests. And everyone on the webinar who's a practitioner in the UK in the Court of Protection, your ears will be pricking up now. So he rejected the best interests approach and called for an absolute ban on all forced and non-consensual medical interventions against persons with disabilities, including medication and the use of restraint and solitary confinement, both long and short term. And building on those reports, the CRPD committee has more recently called for the reform of mental health laws that permit forced treatment, requiring or recommending states to report on measures taken to protect against treatment without free and informed consent. And that interpretation by the committee of the CRPD has faced opposition from some mental health professionals who fear that a ban on forced medical interventions would deny people with disabilities the benefit of life-saving interventions. And opponents on the idea of a ban on forced treatment have sought to define situations in which it may be morally justified to override an individual's objection to an intervention based or due to the person's mental health status or intellectual or cognitive impairment. And in response to the pushback against human rights in medical care, Dr. T's predecessor as UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, Denius Puras, himself a psychiatrist, focused much of his mandate on the issues of capacity in mental health interventions. And he framed the debate in the context of obstacles that people with disabilities face in their struggle to realize the right to health through a mental health system globally, which is dominated by a reductionist biomedical model that diagnoses and treats mental illness. He also pointed out the asymmetry of power in clinical research and public policy settings and the biased evidence in support of mental health interventions. So that's all I wanted to say about the evolution of the CRPD and picking out some of the problematics. The question then is, how has the CRPD sought to be implemented? And that's a topic that Soumitra is now going to address.
Thank you, Oliver. And thanks a lot for all those kind words. And I do remember some of the stories. As usual, if you let Oliver go first, he steals the thunder. So there's not much really left for me to do after everything that he has spoken about. And I'm going to try and cover a few ideas around implementation that we discuss in the chapter, and I would like you to read the chapter but also touch upon them. But before I do that, I have a story of mine too. When I was first working in the area of mental health and human rights, which is in the late 90s, around 98, 99, Larry was a star already. Larry was somebody you went to lectures to listen to and sat in the back and kind of said, wow. And so it's just amazingly a great privilege and honor to be actually writing a chapter in a book that Larry is co-editing. This is not something that in 1999 I would have even dreamt of, that I would be doing that, much less that I would be on the same webinar with him and, of course, Gerard, talking about mental health and human rights. These are people I grew up looking up to. And it's just a great, great opportunity to be able to do this kind of work together with them. So thanks, Ben, for asking Oliver and me to do this chapter. And yes, apologies for really pushing your deadlines and not being keeping up with them. And hopefully, if you give us an opportunity again, after that experience, we will do better. That's a promise. Yeah, so it's quite, I was going to touch upon a couple of implementation issues that I think are relevant, and I do speak from the vantage point of being in a low resource setting. For those of you who don't know, I lived and worked in the UK for about 10 years in the 90s. And I have been back in India since 2000, so I've been here for 20 years. So in a sense, while I do have a perspective of a high-income country setting to some extent, and also now 20 years in India. And I think some of the challenges that we really need to address, and I heard this word being said right at the beginning by someone about intersectionalities. And I think if we are going to look at implementing CRPDs, we have to address the intersectionalities. Because in India, when we were doing the mental health law, the challenge for mental health law implementation, and we can have, you can have an island of excellence of a mental health law in a sea of ignorance of the rest of the legal system. And let me give you an example of what that would mean. In many countries, and especially in low resource countries, people with mental illness don't have a right to vote. Now, if you don't have something as basic as that you don't have the right to vote, and you don't have that citizenship, to then talk about respecting people's will and preferences in the context of mental health treatment, it just does not fit in with the rest of what is going on in society. The other example is like in India, for example, marriage laws will allow you to allow your spouse to get a divorce, even if you do not wish to have one, on the grounds of disability or on the grounds of your psychosocial disability. And this we've done some research and found that this is, although it's a gender neutral law, gets applied in a very gendered sort of manner. So, if you're a woman with a mental health problem, you're more likely to be at the receiving end of a divorce, which you never wanted. And the vice versa is not true. But actually, if you look at the epidemiology of mental health, chronic mental health problems are more common in men rather than in women. But divorce by men of women with mental health problems is far more common. So I think this is places where things like gender and disability start to interact. And so if we are going to address implementing the CRPD, we need to start addressing these intersectionalities. In the absence of addressing the intersectionalities, keeping a very narrow focus on only forced treatment without understanding the contextual space in which all of this is happening, runs the risk of getting laws which remain on paper and which do not actually get implemented, and usual practice continues as it is. So I think that intersectionality is something that we really, really need to address. The second issue that I think implementing CRPD requires addressing is the whole issue of resources. When countries which have very, very low resources, which are devoted to healthcare in general and mental health care, how are you going to get better quality care? How are you going to get care which enhances community living? How are you going to get care which actually meets people's will and preferences? Now, it seems to me that without addressing the issue of resources, human rights in low resource settings is just going to be a lot of words and does not then translate into any action on the ground. And the second thing which is related to resources is universal health care. I cannot see how we are going to get better quality mental health care without making it universal healthcare. It has to be part of the universal healthcare process. And somehow my worry has been that whenever there is talk of universal healthcare, mental health is forgotten. Mental health is left out. And in India, we have a very unusual situation currently. In the mental health law that we helped draft, it provides for universal free access to mental health care. This is in a country which does not have universal free access to healthcare. And so somebody jokingly said, if you're having a heart attack, you don't have the right to be looked after. But if you have a mental health problem, then you're saying that you have a right to be looked after in a particular way. I mean, it does show how bizarre and odd these kind of situations are. And if we need to have proper health care, then it has to be universal health care, and mental health has to be part of it. And universal health care does include quality care, and that would then bring in the entire aspect of the kind of quality of care that we are talking about. So resources and universal health care is an important thing. And the third thing that I think, which is actually an appeal to the international community really, is to realize that in low resource settings, the challenges to reform are many. And the challenges to reform do not necessarily only come from any particular professional groups. While those exist, there are even further challenges, and that you can't do anything that would please everybody. For example, India's mental health law has been criticized from both ends, from the side that it doesn't go far enough, that it's not fully compliant with the CRPD, and at the same time criticized for going too far and not keeping the realities on the ground in its sight. So it seems like you can't get it right either way. And this is a law which when Simon Wesley's group did the review of the Mental Health Act in UK, in their report actually say that they're not going down the Indian Mental Health Act route because they find it is too radical. So, something that is seen as radical for a highly resourced country is equally criticized for being not fully compliant with the CRPD, and is then seen as going too far. So I think these are complex realities, and it is quite easy to say that, well, if you take everything out of context, it's easy to say, well, this is not good enough. But I think one needs to actually put those contextualities into place, try and see where one is trying to go, and see how as an international community, we all can help other countries make progress. And I think one of the things that countries and donors need to really push on is to ensure that there are resources for reform. In the absence of those resources for reform, we are just not going to see any reform on the ground. We'll see a lot of reform in legislation and on paper. We may not necessarily see any difference to people's lives on the ground. So I'm going to stop here and hand over. I can see that Sushin is back again, which is a hint for me to finish. And I'm going to hand over, and I'm sure you all are waiting to listen to Gerard and Dr. T. So I'm going to hand over to Sushin. Thank you so much.
There we go. That's my clock. Sorry, I meant to put it on mute. Anyways, if I could, without further ado, go to Professor Quinn to see if you've got any comments arising from what has been said already, and some thoughts of your own on this very important day.
Thank you very much, Sushin, and congratulations to Soumitra and Oliver, and indeed Ben and Larry, for this amazing publication. I've just been leafing through the table of contents, and it's really, really excited me, I must say. Just 2 or 3 points, and let me begin with a funny story. I began life after my initial graduation as an intern, or a stagiaire as they call it, in the Council of Europe, in the Directorate for Legal Affairs, interested in criminal law, criminal justice. And my head of unit welcomed me on the first day and said, "You're welcome, but I'll show you nothing. I will not allow you access to any files." And I thought to myself, being an impulsive Irishman, this is not good. I'm not going to stay here. So it just so happened to be the case that the guy working next door was working on the draft recommendation to go to the Committee of Ministers in the Council of Europe on legal principles concerning the civil commitment of persons with mental illness. Now, I knew nothing about the subject, and that was my first expose to disability law and policy, and indeed to mental health. I eventually published an article nearly a decade later when all of the lessons had sunk in, but it was quite an amazing experience. And I do recall very vividly some delegations putting forward the view that we are more sophisticated than those barbarian Americans who only focus on the civil rights perspective and not on the social model and the social rights perspective. And therefore, in the recommendation, they parachuted not just civil rights against particular things happening, but positive rights, particularly a right to treatment. And they used that to justify the erosion of those negative civil and political rights. And even back then, I thought there's something strange about this logic. There's something strange about using economic, social, and cultural rights and a positive right to health to actually undermine, which ought to be your very, very basic civil rights. But I've been fascinated ever since by the interplay between positive economic, social, and cultural rights, particularly the right to health, and negative rights to preclude certain treatments or to allow other treatments, but only on the basis of consent, and so on and so forth. I should say the common denominator between Teresa Degener and me is actually Philip Alston, because Philip was the chair of the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is where Teresa began her career. And they drafted the General Comment on Disability back in 1992, 93. And Philip, of course, was my postgraduate supervisor on economic, social, and cultural rights. And it's only really when I took Philip's courses I began to realize the really complex nature of the interaction between both sets of rights, as if they're always dancing a delicate duet. And we're always trying to find the dividing line between both. That's why I think the CRPD is so interesting. By the way, the CRPD resulted from a whole series of accidents, many of which were very beautiful. The involvement of civil society was a complete accident because the European Union put forward the motion that civil society should be directly involved, hoping that 1 or 2 African countries would shoot it out of the water and therefore they could take credit. But in fact, they were shocked to realize that the motion went through, and there we have it. The rest is history in terms of civil society participation. So I find this dance between civil rights and economic and social cultural rights extremely interesting and enduring. And most of the literature you read on it is very abstract, very formulaic. It really doesn't hit home. But it's only when you come to disability and particularly mental health that you see it very vividly in action. And it poses very interesting challenges, as Oliver has pointed to. I would only add to Soumitra that I take the controversial view, right? I stick my neck out all the time, as you know, that the disability treaty isn't really primarily about disability. It's like the latest essay in an ongoing series of essays about what is justice, what is the right relationship between the individual and the collective, whether it's the state or the groups in civil society, and how do we approach difference, and how do we respect difference, and how do we accommodate difference. That's why there's a deep connection between ageism and ableism. There's a deep connection between the feminist movement and the disability movement. If you're true to your history, you will see that the disability rights movement really sprang from the feminist movement in the 1970s and also the anti-racist movement from the 1950s. So that kind of intersectional space is incredibly important. And I would say not primarily because it links one group to another, but because when you look at things intersectionally, you begin asking deeper questions. Whence comes the obstacles that we are facing? Are they shared with other stroke invisible groups and marginalized groups in society? If we're going to have durable, sustainable change, aren't we going to have to do it on a life course basis rather than a purely identity specific basis? So that's why I think the intersectional approach is incredibly important. If you want, it really gets us thinking about the interface between social justice as well as civil rights and where the medium lies. The other thing I would say is that, you know, we've been focusing a lot in the mental health sphere on big ideological battles, which is fine. We all play those battles from time to time and man the barricades when the need arises. But actually, the real battle is in not just articulating an alternative, but building it up and saying, what exactly would community-based services look like? And to me, actually, the mental health field is leading in that regard around the world, but it has a lot of lessons to teach other areas of disability, as well as, for example, future policy for older persons in the community. The WHO is about to come out with a huge report on innovation with respect to services. And I'm going to make this one of the thematic priorities of the UNSR. And there's a lot happening around the world, but the dots have not been joined up. For example, the whole movement toward the personalization of services, et cetera, speaks to the mental health context, but goes far beyond that as well. So I'm really excited about this book, particularly as you cover novel areas like climate change and international trade. That's absolutely first-rate innovation. Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm from Ireland. I talk a lot, so stop me here.
No, that's really brilliant. If we could have like a round of applause, you know, that'd be great. If I could bring in Dr. T, who's Tlang. I'm just going to say Dr. T because I am terrible with pronunciation, but she is the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health. She's a published author, medical doctor with expertise advocating for universal health access, HIV care, youth-friendly services and family planning. It's a real good fortune to have her as well joining us today, and we hope that this will provide her with material to inform her plan on the right to health. Over to you, Dr. T.
Thank you so much, and congratulations, Larry and Ben, on this fantastic book. I wish I had this when I was still a junior medical student, you know, who are still learning about the clinical care and very operationalizing human rights into my clinical practice. And I think it's really just amazing, you know, this achievement and at such an important time. You know, I come from a family, you know, of big family, and my grandfather passed away a few months before I was born, and he actually died of complications from a stroke he had had a few decades earlier. But what I only found out recently, actually, from my mother, is that when he had his stroke, he became aphasic. and he had to, learn different ways of communicating. And at the time, growing up in apartheid South Africa, it meant that they didn't have access to primary health care, never mind specialist care. So for many years, he lived with, complications and morbidities that could have been prevented, had he had access to primary health care treatment. And later on, my mother went to study and became a teacher, and she specialized in teaching children who were blind and deaf, and she could, read Braille. And the first language that I learned was sign language, actually, as a child, because she then had to take me back to work with her as a working mother in the 80s, and she didn't afford daycare. And so I grew up in the classroom, and that was my first language, was sign language. And so some of these issues, we come into them, of course, as human rights experts, but there is some stories, behind the work that we do. And I thought it'd just be important to share that with all of you today. Many of the people in the communities where I live and where I've worked, we think that disability is just a consequence and something that will just happen to some people because they are unlucky. We are still not making, and I say we because I am of the community. We are still not making the link between structural drivers of health and some of the negative health outcomes to the issues around health systems and designing and financing and resourcing, and how even in the global community, we often speak of communicable diseases and neglect often some of the really simple to manage and diagnose non-communicable diseases. And so with coming onto this mandate a few months now, since August, it has really been a time for me to learn and find my way. And because my expertise is on sexual and reproductive health, I do want to look at the intersections of disability and access to sexual and reproductive health rights and services. We live in South Africa, a country that's known worldwide, some of the highest incidences of gender-based violence and specifically rape. And one of the key documents we've been looking at is a national strategic plan to respond to gender-based violence, and how even that document, can still do so much more to move away from just defining gender-based violence as something that happens to cisgender people and people who are non-disabled. And it's so important because for as long as we don't find the issues of people who are already marginalized, if they don't find expression in policy documents, it becomes very difficult to then budget for those programs around access to treatment, diagnostics, rehabilitation, and really talk about sustainable health funding and financing. And my mandate and the scope demands of me to pay particular attention to the needs of people with disabilities and their right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. And I'm starting to add and sexual health too, because we know that adolescents have such a difficult time with puberty and accessing sexual and reproductive health rights. What more young people who are deaf or who are blind or who need mobility aids or have some cognitive conditions that they're dealing with, and that level of attention is still missing, and people just accept that if you are disabled, your rights will be violated somehow, and then it's as if you must be grateful, right, that you have community, and people are not paying attention to the quality of life. And that's part of the work that I envision to do. It's around restoration of dignity. It's around recentering the margins. And I can really only do that, if I learn from colleagues. And that's why I'm here today. I think it's very important for me, as I take on this massive mandate for the next couple of years, to also really understand the different frameworks that are important for rights protections And I do think that intersectional frameworks are important. The work around inter-racism is also important because racism is linked to other systems of oppression, and racism often enables other oppressions and sustains the hierarchy of rights and then how societies are ordered. So the ableism, the sexism, the transphobia, all of those are important, and where they intersect with issues of disability, we know that marginalized people, are often left with no justice or redress, basically, for any rights violations. And so, my presence tonight is just to congratulate you colleagues and just to affirm, my support and immense respect and gratitude for the work that you do. And I plan on finding ways to actually incorporate some of your chapters and some of your learnings in the different institutions where I'm also, a lecturer, to really make sure that we create a new crop, a new generation of clinicians who understand their role as human rights defenders. And I think that's something that I had to teach myself, as an activist, as a young woman who was fighting for her own life and her own survival in a system, in a country that was not designed for me to thrive. And so I know what that's like, but I think this education, medical undergraduate curriculum and postgraduate, can do so much in terms of human rights principles and human rights frameworks, so that we understand that even as doctors, how we practice medicine is in itself a human rights issue. How we practice medicine can be in itself a promotion and protection of rights, and to be intentional about centering the issues that affect people with disabilities. Congratulations, colleagues. I don't have electricity, so before my data and everything else runs low, I just want to apologize if I do slip off, but really I'm quite, it's a pleasure for me to have shared this moment with you all and to have met you, and I hope we can meet up in real person soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was amazing and inspirational. For anybody who has questions and can take advantage of that, please put it in the chat so that I can flag those. Last but not least, we've got Jill Mill Breckenridge, a poet, a writer, a mental health activist, and founder of the Boer Foundation, an Indian charity, which is active in mental health advocacy. She has recently relocated to India, having spent some years in Lancashire and avoiding all the bad rainy weather here. So, she should count herself lucky. But without further ado, I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Shushin. And it's such a, first just to congratulate Larry and Ben on the book, and Soumitra and Oliver. The chapter flows beautifully. I read it and it just is beautiful. And Dr. T and Professor Quinn, it's truly a privilege to be speaking alongside you both. So just to say, I'm really delighted to be here. And so happy International Day of Persons with Disabilities. More power and more strength to us all. I come to you from India, as Shushin has already said, and I'm today wearing my grandmother's scarf. My grandmother would have been 100 this year, and she was the most important person in my life. She taught me about the power of words and the power of truth, and this informs my work in advocacy in many ways. I will start by invoking the famous Urdu poet Faiz and his poem Bol ke lab azad hai tere, which stands for Speak, your lips are still free. And I'll read you a translation. I won't terrify you with the Urdu, the English is here. Speak, your lips are still free. Speak, your tongue still belongs to thee. See flames leap in the blacksmith's shed, steel glowing crimson, hot and red. Watch as padlock's jaws melt to spread, every chain link broken like bits of thread. Speak, the truth is not yet dead. Speak and say what must be said. And I think especially for human rights activists, mental health activists, we need to speak, and we need to make, our words be heard so that we can make change happen. It is 2020. It is a year when the coronavirus has equalized us and shown us how everyone can possibly work from home and be as productive. The facilities and benefits that the disabled were asking for earlier and were not getting are now common for all because of a virus. But I'm here to speak of 2020 and human rights violations continuing even as states ratify and agree to the CRPD. Mental health laws are better, everything is better, but still in 2020, people with mental health issues and psychosocial disability are still being shackled in India, in Indonesia, in many other places. Eugenic sterilization continues in many states and many countries. We think with horror about the Holocaust and doctors and Nazis performing unthinkable experiments and murder in the name of ethnic cleansing and killing the disabled first to create a more normal race. In 2020, such things are still routine as mental institutions continue to treat people with mental illness as less than. In 2017, a hospital in West Bengal in India found inmates naked and being served food directly on the floor because that was easier for the hospital authorities and, maybe to save on the laundry bills. So they are treated like animals or worse. And although, as Soumitra also said, the laws exist, but on the ground reality is different. And doctors and medical superintendents and nurses carrying sticks and batons, they create their own rules and regulations. And enforcement turns a blind eye because this is a culture of paternalism where doctors are treating people for their own good. Who gets to decide whose agency is stripped? Who gets to decide who is the treater and who the treated? We need to equalize power dynamics so that we can stop this misuse of power. In my own case, I was in a mental institution in India in 2007 and 2012. I'll read you a short excerpt of a poem I had written, which is called Treatment, about my time in an institution. That was treatment, those hands crawling on your body, the poison injected, stripped, dragged along corridors, a faint smell of formaldehyde and phenyl. That was treatment, the laughter of nurses, the condescension of doctors, the asking of the same questions every day until you utter the words they want to hear. That was treatment. That was treatment. Medical professionals are not interested in disability rights. I hear Dr. T and I applaud her for saying that we should be teaching this to the medical professionals. But at the moment, especially in India, perhaps, medical professionals are not interested in the disability rights. It's harder for them. It's easier to shackle, chemically restrain, and do what they need to do. It is quicker, cheaper, and less human resource intensive. Although the laws exist to prevent discrimination on the basis of mental illness, these continue to be flouted as widespread stigma still surrounds mental illness. Families, judges in court, the police, they all have their own opinion on mental health that is enforced and reinforced by popular culture like films and newspaper headlines like "Man with schizophrenia goes on a killing rampage." In my own case, just as Soumitra was mentioning about the gender issue, in my own case, my ex-husband cited mental illness in his divorce petition and proceeded to flee the country midway through our case, kidnapping my 4 children. I was unable to do anything, and my parents supported him and this decision. So there is a lack of political will, there is a lack of information, and because people continue to hide their family members with mental illness, secrets continue to fester under carpets and behind closed doors. That is why last year I edited an anthology on mental health essays, which was released in 2019. It's called Side Effects of Living. It's now being taught in some universities in India. I believe this is a good first step towards speaking our truth and providing information to families, caregivers, and others in a non-academic, non-medical format. I also want to talk about the lack of the accessible community-based services, art as therapy, etc., and a lack of funding, perhaps because of lack of political will. In the UK, where I was based for the last 4 years, there is Arts Council funding for such projects and a lot of enthusiasm. And I taught poetry as therapy in a few spaces, NHS facilities, as well as prisons. Here, we don't have such facilities, they are hard to access. But it is common to find people accessing religious and faith healers, and though this can often work, some dargahs shackle people with mental illness to bars. And is this not another form of an institution? So it is vital to bring a human rights advocacy lens to how people with mental health issues receive and access services. In 2014, I was part of a report released by Human Rights Watch, which stated that women and girls with mental illness in institutions in India are treated worse than animals. There is still forced treatment, it is rampant. Where is the question of agency in a patriarchal country like India, where parents are supposed to know best? In May 2020, just this year, Anjana Harish, a 21-year-old bisexual, took her own life after her parents made her undergo conversion therapy. Although the law says conversion therapy is illegal, doctors and quacks exploit families and continue to offer these services. I am Anjana Harish. I am Bharti Manoj. I am Sushant Singh Rajput. I am Robin Williams. I am Kate Spade. I am all the unseen and overlooked people who live with mental illness. I am all the people who die with suicide. I am all the LGBTQ people, the Dalit people, and the ones otherwise marginalized. I am all these stories, all these people. The time to bring change is now, and I hope this book will show us the way. Thank you so much for listening.
That is really amazing. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. Right, well, we have a little bit of time for questions. There's a question in the chat, which I thought ties in really well with what you've just been saying, Jamil, and also with what Oliver and Soumitra were touching on. And that is a question, someone said, the challenge that has haunted me over the years is the notion that mental health and mental capacity law is based on control. How does this square with the notion of human rights? I don't know whether or not Dr. T, you're still online, and whether or not you want to, if we could ask you to kick off in thinking about this question. Maybe?
Yeah, I'm still here. I just went up to read the question. Look, I think the issue of control, like Jamil said, it really speaks about autonomy, right? And the paternalism that is embedded in medical care. And the fact that we genuinely, as humans, don't respect each other's autonomy. And this is autonomy across the board. And the issue with disability is that it adds another layer of vulnerability, and it adds another layer of obstruction. And so if you think of the interconnectedness of human rights, so the right to information, the right to safety and live in communities that are free of violence, when you are being raped, it's not about the sex, it's about power and control. Right? And we know that women who are disabled are often raped in communities, and there's a silencing around it. And in some instances, there's a stigma that's associated with the person who then is the victim, right? And because they are disabled, they don't access trauma centers, and then they live now with the trauma, with the health consequences, sometimes seroconverting, and then having an unsupportable pregnancy, for example. And then people look at all of those compounding situations or those conditions as if it's part of them not having capacity to make decisions or them having a cognitive challenge, as opposed to looking at the systemic failures that we are failing people as health systems, as people in governance, as people in leadership. But it's easy to just shift and blame and shame people who are surviving violence, which is systemic, often an interpersonal violence. And all of it is about control, right? Even if you look at the medical negligence that happens when women are giving birth, and they're having perhaps a delayed stage of labor and they don't get access to cesareans in time, and children are born with cerebral palsy. The obstetric violence, the underlying driver of obstetric violence is again control and lack of respect for human rights. So I do see the link for me between mental health, this idea of capacity and who makes decisions, and power, and how medicine says to doctors and clinicians and nurses and other allied health professionals, if you think you need to use force or you need to use whatever, you get taught which form to sign and say involuntary, voluntary, they were, resisting whatever it is, as opposed to training us to be compassionate, training us to understand how human rights are important and what true autonomy is. It's as if we hold the power. And if you're the patient who knows what they want, who can advocate for themselves, suddenly you're not a good doctor anymore because you are not exerting that force onto them. That's just how I interpreted that. Thank you.
I don't know when that, Soumitra, did you want to come in also with your views on this?
Hi, I wanted to kind of really pick up on what Jilmil said, that I think this is Jilmil really brought into perspective that while we are talking about the CRPD, while we are talking about new laws, and while we are talking about changing systems, there is a disconnect between what happens on the ground and what happens in people's lived realities versus what happens in international fora, in public documents, in laws, in policies. And I think that this disconnect is huge. And unless we can bridge that disconnect in some sort of way, a lot of this is not going to make any difference to the average person who has mental health problems and needs help for it. We seem to just be failing at that. And I think the international community has kind of patted itself on the back and said, well, we've done our job. Now we've got this wonderful convention and we are trying to enforce it. And it doesn't make any difference to people's lives. So I think the next real challenge for the international community, and especially for the UN system and even for the CRPD system, is to really push itself to say, how are we going to actually make a difference on the ground? How are we going to touch the lives of that person who lives in a village in Africa or a village in India who has no access to basic necessities when they have a mental health problem? And I think that's really what we should be looking at.
That's really helpful. I'm just looking at the time and I've been given strict instructions to end at 6. So if I could bring Ben in again with sort of this kind of thought that was in the chat, which is that obviously we are currently facing these unprecedented challenges with the global health pandemic over COVID, and human rights of people's autonomy, control, liberty, all of it is being tested. Who's deserving, who's not, all of that is being tested. And I wondered whether or not, in the context of the book and its text of looking at the past, present, and the future, you could kind of draw out what lessons we can learn and how we can look to the future, and use that as a way to wrap up the day. Oh, you're on mute. That's okay, it happens.
Pardon the technical difficulties. It's really inspiring. And before I address that issue, I want to thank everyone who spoke today for a really inspiring examination of the development, the implementation, the application of human rights to address these issues of disability and mental health, particularly under the CRPD, really taking us from the horrors of forced institutionalization to moving toward the realization of community-based rehabilitation under international law for all. Picking up, I think, where Soumitra left off, I want us to think about how we could make that progress going forward. It was exciting that Gerard really helped us to think about the past, how the CRPD came into development, providing a sense of how civil society came to understand its own voice and to work on developing both civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights as indivisible and interrelated under this single treaty. As we move forward in Dr. T's comments, I was really inspired by the way in which she sees this as central to her mandate, that we need to understand sustainable funding to address the needs of disabled populations and the wide range of rights that are implicated in assuring sustainable populations, from disability rights to sexual and reproductive health and rights, to a wide range of overlapping vulnerabilities and intersectional rights that are necessary in both health policy and in medical training. And Jamil really helped to find the voice of civil society with which Gerard began, to speak, as she said, to focus on how people can use their voice to affect change. I live in a country where the people who speak the first and often the loudest are able to achieve policy victories. Sometimes they even get elected president of the United States. How do advocates for human rights find their voice? How do they find their voice in order to equalize power relations, in order to uphold autonomy, and prevent vulnerable populations from being harmed? These presentations together help to exemplify the principal ideal of our work and the field of health and human rights itself. That this field is more than simply the application of human rights law to global health threats. It's about a shared vision of both global health and human rights, where the practice of health is framed by human rights norms and principles, and the framing of human rights law is itself influenced by the health experiences of vulnerable populations. It's this interdisciplinary whole that is greater than the sum of its parts that makes this field so exciting. And in addressing your question, Shushin, at the end, we focus at the end of our book on the ways in which this pandemic is changing the way we see health and human rights, is more necessary than ever before. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention in closing that these are dark times for global health and human rights. Our final chapter examines the populist challenges to future progress, challenging the shared goals of our globalizing world. Populism is seeking to retrench nations inward. Right-wing populist nationalism is challenging institutions of global health, violating the rights of vulnerable populations, spurring isolationism in international affairs. These are dark times for global health and human rights, with much of the past progress that Oliver began with now under threat. And yet we find light in the darkness. And it's that idea of light in the darkness that's represented on the cover of the book. It's reflected in our dedication. It's woven through each chapter of the text. That this light in the darkness, and by that we mean the next generation, our students, they are our light guiding us forward in these dark times. And so in supporting their continuing struggle to uphold human rights in global health, I'm really inspired by today's discussions because they bring us a sense that the academic work that we do has import for policymakers, for practitioners, for the people who are affected by human rights. So thank you to Oliver and Soumitra for sharing your knowledge with the next generation. Thank you to Gerard and Saleh and Jamil for your thoughtful reflections on this work. Thank you to Shushin for organizing this event and making all of this possible, including our sponsors who've been able to bring everyone together to celebrate this chapter. We'll be holding another launch of this book, bringing together all 38 of our contributors in just 1 week on Human Rights Day. And I hope that some of you will be able to attend that discussion also. Until then, know that these are dark times, but I hope to see everyone in person again soon. I'm excited for the future because that future is based upon the advocates who are fighting for human rights and global health. And I hope that we're all working together in order to prepare the next generation for the challenges ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. And thank you to everyone who is on the panel. It's been a real privilege to hear what you have to say and to hear the experiences that you've shared. And I just want to thank Doughty Street Chambers and the Centre for Law and Social Justice at the School of Law of University of Leeds for co-hosting this and for making this possible tonight. I hope everybody enjoyed this. I put a link to the book to buy the book. Everyone who logs off now should go immediately and press that link to buy the book, because certainly I will do. And thank you very much for joining us this evening. Have a good evening.